You are listening to a story that might seem like a legend, but its roots are all too real. When you are left alone with the darkness in the middle of a vast ocean, every sound, every shadow, every creak becomes a threat. And sometimes, the greatest threat comes from where you least expect it, from the direction of a ghostly hope for salvation. Imagine an endless aquatic desert, where the sky merges with the water into a single black abyss. You are aboard a small vessel that the elements have decided to test for strength. All around you is the roar of the wind and gigantic waves playfully tossing your fragile shelter. And just when it seems all hope is lost, it emerges from the fog, a silent, dark silhouette. An enormous ship that could be your salvation, but instead prepares a fate for you more terrifying than any storm. This story is not just a tale of survival. It is a terrifying journey not only into the depths of the ocean, but into the depths of the human consciousness. It is a story of how fear can become contagious, how it can turn a trusted companion into a deadly enemy, and a silent ship into a trap with no escape. We will walk the decks where time has stood still, peer into cabins that hold the secrets of their inhabitants' final seconds, and descend into the holds where the echo of a long-past catastrophe still resounds. We will try to understand what happened to its crew and why this Leviathan still wanders the ocean, as if searching for new victims. Is it a trick of the imagination, mass hysteria, or something far older and more sinister, lurking within the very metal flesh of the ship? Be prepared, for this journey will make you question reality and look anew at the darkness that hides just beyond the thin veil of civilization. Music swells slightly with more tension, then fades. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories of survival and disaster. It all began as a perfect sea voyage. The small tourist vessel, the Dream, designed for 12 passengers and 4 crew members, departed from the coast at sunset. Captain Arthur Weston, a gray-haired man with a weathered face and a calm gaze, promised a 3-day trip with deep-sea fishing and stargazing, far from the light pollution of big cities. A festive atmosphere reigned on board. A young couple, Mark and Lisa, took selfies against the crimson horizon. An elderly history professor, Mr. Humphrey, engaged in a leisurely conversation with a young biologist named Eva. Several other families with children laughed on the deck, enjoying the warm evening and the salty breeze. Nothing foretold disaster. The Atlantic was as calm as a sleeping giant. The first few hours of the journey passed in serenity. The crew, consisting of the captain, his first mate, an engineer, and a cook, went about their duties with routine efficiency. However, as midnight approached, the mood began to shift. The sky, just an hour ago strewn with stars, was now covered by a dense blanket of clouds. The wind, which had been gently toying with the passengers' hair, suddenly became gusty and cold. Captain Weston glanced more and more frequently at the radar and the barometer, a deep frown creasing his forehead. He ordered the passengers to go below deck, assuring them it was just a temporary change in the weather, a common occurrence in the ocean. But this was no common occurrence. Within half an hour, the Dream was being tossed on the waves like a toy. The storm hit suddenly, with a ferocity no one could have predicted. The rain turned into a solid wall of water, drumming against the metal hull. The wind howled in the rigging, producing eerie, drawn-out sounds. The passengers, moments ago filled with joy, now sat in the main cabin, clinging to tables and chairs. Children's laughter had turned to crying, and adult conversations to a tense silence. The waves reached 8, sometimes even 10 meters high. They crashed onto the deck with a deafening roar, and it seemed the vessel's thin hull would crack at any moment. The engines strained at their limit, their labored hum barely audible over the roar of the storm. The engineer, pale as a sheet, monitored the gauges, trying to keep them running. Captain Weston stood at the helm, his face a stone mask, but his eyes, peering into the black wall of water ahead, held unconcealed alarm. His first mate tried to contact the Coast Guard, but only fragments of phrases broke through the static. They were alone. Fear became almost palpable. It saturated the air, mixing with the smell of salt and ozone. The passengers were silent, each processing the horror in their own way. Some prayed, others just stared blankly into space. The crew maintained an outward calm, but their sharp, Jerky movements and the way they avoided the passengers' eyes betrayed their own fear. They knew the Dream was not built for such a tempest. A few more hours of this, and the ship would either capsize or be torn apart. And then, at that very moment, in the heart of the storm, when hope was nearly extinguished, something incredible happened. In a brief flash of lightning that momentarily tore through the darkness, the first mate saw a silhouette ahead. It was massive, dark, incomparably larger than their Dream. It was a large ship, but there was something strange about it, something sinister. Not a single signal light was on. It didn't respond to radio calls. It just stood there in the middle of the roaring ocean, motionless and silent, like a giant tombstone. It had appeared from the fog and rain, as if born of the storm itself, and now it was waiting. The appearance of the unknown vessel provoked mixed feelings, relief and an even greater fear. On one hand, it was a chance for survival. On the other, its appearance was deeply unsettling. Captain Weston, peering at the dark behemoth through the water-streaked portholes, hesitated. Maritime law required rendering aid to those in distress, but this ship looked like distress itself. Why were there no lights? Why wasn't the crew responding? Was anyone even alive on board? But they had no choice. The Dream was taking on water. One of the engines had died, and the vessel was losing steerage. The waves battered it with renewed force, and the captain knew another half an hour, and they would sink. He made the only possible decision, to try and approach the unknown ship and transfer everyone aboard. It was a desperate move, almost suicidal in these conditions, but the alternative was even worse, certain death in the icy waves of the Atlantic. The first mate relayed the decision to the passengers. The panic, which had been suppressed until now, burst forth. "We can't. It's madness," screamed one of the women. "What is that ship? What if they're pirates?" her husband echoed. But the captain's words were firm. "Either we try this, or we all die right here. The choice is yours." And the choice was obvious. Approaching the giant was incredibly difficult. The Dream was thrown from side to side. Several times, their small boat nearly smashed against the large ship's rusty hull. The first mate and the engineer, risking their lives, dashed onto the deck to prepare the mooring lines. The icy wind knocked them off their feet, and waves washed over the deck, trying to sweep them into the ocean. Finally, after several failed attempts, they managed to throw grappling hooks onto a ledge of the unknown vessel. The Dream crashed against the metal with a loud thud, but held fast. Once alongside, the ship looked even more ominous. It was old, its hull covered in streaks of rust that ran down to the water like bloody tears. The paint on the nameplate had almost worn away, but a few letters could be made out. "Oh," rang. There was no sound but the howl of the wind and the crash of the waves. Not a single light in the hundreds of portholes that stared back at them like the empty eye sockets of a skull. The ship seemed utterly dead. The evacuation began. The crew threw across a storm ladder. Moving from the heaving deck of their boat to the steady hull of the giant was a true ordeal. The children were passed over first, then the women. Every step was a risk. Mark barely held on to Lisa when another wave almost threw her into the chasm between the two vessels. Professor Humphrey, despite his age, acted with dignity, helping the others. Captain Weston was the last to leave the Dream. He cast a final farewell glance at his sinking ship and, with a heavy heart, climbed aboard the strange vessel. Just as the last person was on deck, one of the mooring lines snapped with a loud crack. The Dream was torn from the hull and dragged into the darkness. A few moments later, it was swallowed by another wave. They were left alone on the unknown ghost ship. The deck was empty and slippery with rain. The wind whistled between the numerous superstructures, creating an eerie melody. It was as if the ship itself was breathing, and its breath was cold and hostile. The silence here was oppressive, unnatural. It pressed on their eardrums more heavily than the roar of the storm. They stood huddled together, soaked to the bone, frozen and terrified, not knowing what awaited them inside this rusted leviathan. Their only desire was to find shelter from the storm, but instinct told them the worst was yet to come. The first few minutes aboard the Orang, as they had mentally christened the ship, were spent in a state of shocked numbness. 16 people, saved from the elements, stood on the open deck, none daring to take a step. Captain Weston was the first to break the silence. We need to find shelter and try to call for help. Let's split into groups. Myself, my first mate, and Mark will head for the bridge. The rest of you, find a door to the interior, but stay together and don't go far." His voice sounded confident, but it was a feigned confidence. Everyone felt the oppressive atmosphere of the place. The deck was cluttered with debris, fragments of crates, scraps of rope. A capsized lifeboat lay in one spot. It looked as if the ship had recently endured another, much more powerful storm. The remaining group found an unlocked door leading into a corridor. The first mate, a man named David, shone his flashlight into the dark opening. The beam snatched a long, narrow corridor from the darkness, its walls covered in rust and moisture. The air was heavy, musty, with a sweetish smell of decay and mold. Reluctantly, fighting their fear, the people began to step inside, away from the piercing wind. The corridor led to a mess hall, and what they saw there made them stop at the threshold. The room had been abandoned in an incredible hurry. On the tables were plates with food that had long since spoiled and was covered in a layer of gray mold. Cups were overturned, playing cards and an open book were scattered on the floor. An officer's jacket hung on the back of a chair. It was as if the crew had abruptly stood up from the table and vanished. Lisa, Mark's wife, covered her mouth with her hand, suppressing a wave of nausea. "What happened here?" she whispered. No one answered. People began to cautiously inspect the room. Personal belongings were scattered on the floor: photographs, letters, a child's toy, a small wooden ship. These silent witnesses to someone's life made the scene even more unsettling. Not a soul, not a sound, except for their own footsteps and the creaking floorboards. But the silence was deceptive. Everyone felt as if they were being watched. It was an irrational but incredibly strong feeling. Each person instinctively looked over their shoulder, peering into dark corners and doorways. Professor Humphrey, trying to maintain a scientific perspective, remarked, "It looks like a panicked evacuation. But why? The ship is intact. No signs of fire or a breach." Meanwhile, the captain's group reached the bridge. The same chaos reigned there. Navigational charts were scattered on the floor, and one of the portholes was shattered. The radio was dead. Captain Weston turned the knobs in vain. Only static came from the speaker. "The power is out," he stated. Mark shone his flashlight on the ship's logbook, which lay open on a table. The last entry was written in a hurried, illegible scrawl. The date. Mark couldn't make it out. The ink had blurred from the moisture. Suddenly, the engineer, a man named Frank who was walking last in the group exploring the corridor, spun around. "Did you hear that?" he asked fearfully. "What?" Eva replied, confused. "Footsteps. Right behind me. Someone was following us." Everyone fell silent, listening. The corridor was utterly quiet. "You're imagining things, Frank. It's your nerves." One of the passengers tried to reassure him, but Frank insisted, "I'm sure I heard it. Light, quick footsteps, like someone running barefoot on the metal." This incident heightened the tension. The feeling of being watched by an unseen presence became almost unbearable. They were not alone on this ship, and whoever was here was in no hurry to reveal themselves, preferring to remain in the shadows, watching them. After the failed attempt to contact the outside world, Captain Weston gathered everyone in the mess hall. The situation was critical. They were trapped on an abandoned vessel in the middle of a storm, without communication and with dwindling supplies. They needed a plan. "We need to find 3 things," the captain said, trying to keep his voice steady. "First, a power source to get the radio working. That will likely be in the engine room. Second, food and drinkable water that hasn't spoiled. And third, medical supplies. Some of us were injured during the crossing." The people, though terrified, understood the need for action. They split up again. One group, led by the first mate David, went in search of the galley and the infirmary. The other, led by Weston himself and the engineer Frank, was to descend into the ship's depths toward the engine room. Professor Humphrey, Mark, and Eva joined the captain, hoping to find documents that could shed light on the crew's fate. Lisa and the other passengers with children remained in the mess hall. It seemed the relatively safest place. The descent into the ship's interior was like a plunge into hell. The stairs leading down were narrow, slippery, and rusted. Each step echoed loudly and ominously through the metal corridors. The flashlight beams tore labyrinths of pipes, valves, and wires from the darkness. hanging from the ceiling like vines in a steel jungle. The air grew heavier and more humid. Water seeped from everywhere, creating the illusion that the ship was slowly dying, bleeding rust. They descended deeper, deck by deck. The corridors were cluttered with junk, sometimes forcing them to squeeze through blockages. On one of the lower decks, they found what was once the radio room. The equipment was smashed, as if someone had furiously destroyed it with a hammer. Strange, Frank muttered. If the crew was abandoning ship, why would they destroy the means of communication? On a table amidst the wreckage, Mark spotted a walkie-talkie. He grabbed it and inspected it hopefully. The batteries are dead, he said, disappointed. But if we can find a charger and get a generator running. It was a tiny sliver of hope. The deeper they went, the stronger the strange sound became. It was a low, vibrating hum that seemed to emanate from the hull itself. At first, it could be mistaken for the operation of some auxiliary machinery or the sound of water outside. But the hum was too monotonous, too organic. It sounded like a prolonged, pained moan. "What is that sound?" Eva asked nervously, stopping. Frank, the engineer, listened intently. "I don't know. It doesn't sound like the engines. Maybe it's the hull resonating from the storm." But his voice lacked conviction. Captain Weston also stopped, peering into the darkness ahead. "The sound is coming from the cargo hold," he said. An argument broke out. "It's just mechanical noise," Mark insisted, though he didn't believe it himself. "No, it's not," Professor Humphrey countered. "This sound, it triggers an instinctual anxiety. It might be infrasound." Eva, the biologist, recalled that some animals use infrasound for communication, and it can induce feelings of fear and panic in humans. The argument grew louder. Fear and uncertainty frayed their nerves. People began accusing each other of being alarmists. Captain Weston had to intervene. "Enough. We have to stick together. Frank, can you identify it if we get closer?" The engineer nodded uncertainly. They continued their journey toward the source of the sound, toward the heart of the ship. With every step, the hum grew louder, seeming to penetrate their very bones. It was transforming into a moan. A wail, a scream of endless suffering forever imprinted in the metal of this cursed vessel. They were walking into the dark hold, not knowing what awaited them there, answers or death. While the captain's group descended into the ship, First Mate David's team searched the upper decks. They had better luck. They found the galley. Although most of the food had spoiled, they found canned goods, biscuits, and several bottles of drinking water in sealed containers. It was a small victory that slightly lifted their spirits. After the galley, they decided to look for the infirmary. They moved cautiously, lighting their way with flashlights. The labyrinth of corridors seemed endless and uniform. One of the tourists, a young man named Tom, kept falling behind, curiously peering into every open door. David reprimanded him several times, urging him to stay with the group. In one of the corridors, Tom lagged behind again. He noticed a half-open cabin door from which, he thought, a faint sound like music was coming. "Hey, I'll be right back," he called out to the others, and, without waiting for a reply, slipped inside. The rest of the group, tired and on edge, had walked a few more meters before they noticed he was gone. "Where's Tom?" David asked, stopping. Everyone turned around. The corridor behind them was empty and dark. "He was just here," a woman said, surprised. David sighed in frustration. "Tom, this is no time for games. Come out," he shouted into the darkness. The response was silence. And then, from the very cabin Tom had entered, came a short, piercing scream. It was not a scream of pain, but of sudden, inhuman terror. It ended as abruptly as it began. For a moment, everyone froze, paralyzed by fear. "Tom!" David yelled and sprinted back. The others ran after him. They burst into the cabin. It was a standard sailor's cabin, a bunk bed, a small table, a locker, and it was empty. Tom's flashlight lay on the floor, its beam trembling on the opposite wall. The porthole was sealed shut. There was no music. "He couldn't have just vanished," someone cried out in panic. They searched the tiny cabin, looking under the bed and in the locker. Nothing. David went to the porthole and looked out. Beyond the glass, the storm raged and the waves churned. "Maybe he fell overboard," a woman suggested. "Impossible. The porthole is bolted from the inside. And we would have heard a splash," David retorted. Tom's disappearance was the catalyst for panic. They no longer felt merely lost. They felt like prey. An unseen predator, hiding in the darkness of this ship, had begun its hunt. They rushed back to the mess hall, pushing each other in the narrow corridors. Fear drove them, making them glance back at every shadow. When they burst into the room where the others were waiting, their terrified faces said it all. The story of Tom's disappearance and the aborted scream sowed chaos. "I told you we should have stayed on the dream," a mother of two cried hysterically. "We're all going to die here." Some of the others agreed with her. They demanded to return to their own vessel immediately. "There's nothing to return to," David replied grimly. "The dream has sunk." This news was the final blow. The realization that there was no way back broke many of them. People started shouting, blaming the crew, blaming the captain. Panic was escalating into hysteria. Just then, Captain Weston's group returned. They hadn't found the engine room, but they brought back the oppressive feeling of the eerie hum from below. Seeing the state of the mess hall, Weston tried to take control. He listened to the account of Tom's disappearance, his face growing even darker. But his voice remained firm. "Panic is our greatest enemy. We can't run anywhere right now. Outside this ship is certain death. The storm hasn't subsided. We must stay here at least until morning. In the morning, at first light, when the weather improves, we can search the deck, find life rafts, and leave this place. For now, everyone stays together. No one goes anywhere alone." His words had an effect. The people calmed down slightly, but the fear didn't disappear. It merely lay in wait. They huddled together in the center of the mess hall, far from the dark doorways and windows. No one even dared to speak. They just sat and waited for morning, listening to the sounds of the ship, the groaning metal, the howling wind, and the distant, terrifying moan that rose from its black depths. The night dragged on endlessly. No one could sleep. Every shadow in the corner seemed a threat. Every creak made them flinch. To distract themselves and try to find some answers, Professor Humphrey, along with Eva and Mark, decided to examine the cabins adjacent to the mess hall. Captain Weston reluctantly agreed, on the condition that they stay close and within sight. Carefully, lighting their way with flashlights, they entered the cabins. They were all similar, abandoned in haste, with personal belongings scattered about. But in one, which appeared to have belonged to a senior officer, they found what they were looking for. On the desk lay a thick, leather-bound notebook, the ship's log. Professor Humphrey gently picked it up. The pages were damp, but the ink was still fairly clear. He sat at the desk, while Eva and Mark leaned over him, aiming their flashlight beams at the pages. The professor began to read aloud, his voice trembling with a mix of excitement and foreboding. The first entries were routine. The ship, named the Orang Medan, was a cargo vessel carrying some unspecified freight. Coordinates, weather conditions, speed, everything was normal. But about 2 weeks before the final date in the log, the tone of the entries began to change. October 12th, the professor read. A strange apathy among the crew. Men complained of headaches and a constant sense of anxiety. Engineers reported a strange low-frequency hum in the engine room. Its source cannot be identified. Mark and Eva exchanged a look. The hum they had heard below. The professor turned the page. October 15th. The situation is worsening. Several sailors reported seeing moving shadows in the corridors. I dismissed it as fatigue, but last night I heard footsteps outside my own cabin door, though no one was on watch. The subsequent entries grew increasingly alarming. The officer wrote that the crew was becoming paranoid. Men grew afraid of the dark and refused to walk alone. Talk began to circulate that there was a stranger on board. October 20th. The first instance of violence. 2 sailors fought in the galley over a trivial matter. One claimed the other was not who he seemed. There was an emptiness in his eyes, he said. They had to be pulled apart. The men are developing a strange, glassy-eyed stare. October 23rd. This is no longer just fear. It is mass madness. The men have started having hallucinations. They say the ship's walls are breathing and that voices are coming from the hold. Today the radio operator burst in, screaming that he had received a message. When I asked from whom, he whispered, from the ship itself. Then he smashed all the equipment in the radio room. Eva shivered, remembering the destroyed equipment. It all fit. Professor Humphrey continued turning the pages. The last few entries were written with a trembling hand, the letters erratic. October 25th. We have lost several men. They simply vanished. No one knows where. The captain has locked himself in his cabin and lets no one in. I can hear him talking to himself. Or not to himself. The hum, it's getting louder. It gets inside your head, drives you mad. It is not just a sound. It is a voice. It promises things. It promises salvation through death. October 26th. Everyone is dead. Or mad. I am alone. I have barricaded myself in my cabin. They are breaking down the door. But they are not men anymore. Their faces are twisted in terror. Their eyes are empty. They are calling my name. They say the ship is hungry. The final entry was short, scrawled in large, uneven letters. It took up the entire page. We hear voices in the metal. They are coming for us. After that phrase, the log ended. Professor Humphrey closed it. A dead silence fell upon the cabin. Now they knew. This ship wasn't merely abandoned. Its crew had not evacuated. They had destroyed each other or died of terror, driven insane by something that resided within the very structure of this vessel. The Orang Medan was not just a ship. It was a tomb. And now they were locked inside with whatever had killed its previous occupants. History was beginning to repeat itself. The contents of the logbook destroyed any last shred of hope for a rational explanation. The atmosphere in the mess hall became unbearable. Every sound, every creak was now perceived as a manifestation of the same sinister force that had annihilated the crew of the Orang Medan. The people sat huddled in a tight group, afraid to even move. The darkness beyond their small island of flashlight beams seemed alive and hostile. And then it began. First, they heard the footsteps. Clear, measured footsteps in the corridor, just outside the door. Someone was pacing back and forth, unhurriedly, as if on patrol. Several of the men, including David and Mark, rushed to the door and blocked it with a table. The footsteps paused for a moment, then resumed, now moving away. Next, the doors began to slam. Down the corridor, cabin doors slammed shut and swung open one after another, as if an unseen resident was inspecting its domain. The sound was sharp, metallic, and blood-chilling. The children began to cry, and the adults could only look at each other helplessly, their faces contorted with fear. The bravest among them tried to reassure the others that it was just the draft, the wind playing tricks in an old ship. But these explanations sounded pathetic and unconvincing. Suddenly, Lisa, Mark's wife, screamed and pointed a trembling hand toward the far end of the mess hall. There! Someone was standing there, she whispered. Everyone looked into the dark corner. No one was there. You're imagining it. Honey, it's just a shadow. Mark tried to calm her. But Lisa insisted, no. I saw a silhouette. Tall and dark. It just stood there watching us. And then, it faded away. Her words sowed a new wave of panic. People started seeing things. In the reflections on the porthole glass, they saw faces. In the dark spaces between tables, shadows darted by. It was a classic case of mass hysteria, fueled by fear, isolation, and the terrifying accounts from the logbook. Their minds, exhausted by the storm and stress, began to fail, creating hallucinations. But the most terrifying thing happened to Frank, the engineer. He had been sitting apart from everyone, staring into space. His lips were moving as if he was talking to someone. Eva, with some knowledge of psychology, approached him. "Frank, are you all right?" she asked softly. He slowly raised his eyes to her, and Eva flinched. His gaze was empty, glassy, the same gaze the officer had described in the log. "They're here," Frank whispered. "They never left. The whole crew is here. They say they need help. They want us to help them start the engines." "Frank, there's no one here," Eva said gently. "It's your imagination." Suddenly, Frank's face twisted into a mask of fury. "You're lying. You're with them. You want to stop us," he screamed. His voice had changed, becoming hoarse and alien. He leaped to his feet. "The captain is waiting for me on the bridge. We have to go." Captain Weston and David tried to stop him. "Frank, calm down. Sit down," Weston commanded. But Frank seemed neither to hear nor see them. He was seeing something else, something known only to him. With inhuman strength, he threw David aside and lunged at the captain, trying to grab his throat. His eyes burned with a mad fire. "The ship won't let us go. We must serve it," he roared. Mark and the other men barely managed to pull him off. Frank struggled, biting and screaming in a voice not his own, shouting names none of them recognized. It was an attack of pure, uncontrollable madness. In the end, they had to tie him up with ropes, like a wild animal. He lay on the floor, still muttering, his eyes fixed on an unseen world. Everyone stared at him in silent horror. They had witnessed firsthand how this invisible force could break a human mind. They realized they were facing not just death, but something worse, the loss of themselves, a transformation into the same insane phantoms that perhaps still roamed these rusty corridors. The night of horror continued, and not all of them might live to see the morning. With the first glimmers of dawn, the storm began to weaken. The roar of the wind subsided to a prolonged whistle, and the giant waves gradually settled. Through breaks in the clouds, a pale, gray light shone through. For the exhausted and terrified survivors, this light became a symbol of hope. Captain Weston stood up. The sleepless night had left deep shadows under his eyes, but his determination had returned. "Prepare to disembark," he said firmly. "The storm is passing. We will find survival craft and get off this cursed place." No one argued. The thought of spending even one more hour on the Orang Medan was unbearable. They left the bound Frank under the watch of a few women. The engineer was still delirious, but his violent fit had passed, replaced by apathy. On deck, they saw that the ocean was still rough, but no longer deadly. They split into groups and began searching the deck for lifeboats or rafts. Fortunately, several inflatable life rafts in their containers appeared to be intact. A frantic preparation began. The men worked to lower the heavy containers to the side of the ship. The women gathered the remaining food and water. Every movement was filled with haste and fear. Everyone expected something horrible to emerge from the ship's dark superstructures at any moment. Every creak of the metal made them jump and look around. The ship was silent, but its silence was ominous, as if it were gathering itself for a pounce. When the first raft was inflated and launched, the evacuation began. Once again, like the previous night, children and women were lowered first. It was dangerous. The raft was tossed by the waves, bumping against the rusty hull. But the fear of what was left behind was stronger than the fear of the ocean. At that moment, as half the people were already on the raft, something happened that finally broke their will. From the depths of the ship, from its dark corridors, they heard voices. "Don't go. Stay with us." A soft, pleading whisper seemed to come from everywhere at once. And then the voices began to call them by name. "Mark, Lisa, David, don't leave us." The voices were varied, male, female, childish. They were filled with longing and loneliness. And the most terrifying part was when they heard the voice of Tom, the young man who had disappeared the day before. "It's not so bad here. The ship will take care of you." The people on the deck froze in terror. Those on the raft screamed desperately for them to jump. Captain Weston, pale but resolute, practically pushed people toward the edge. "It's not real. It's an illusion. Get down," he yelled. At the last moment, as the captain and his first mate David prepared to leave the ship, they glanced up at the bridge. And there, behind the dark glass, they saw silhouettes. Several human figures stood there, silently watching them. They didn't move. They just observed as their new toys slipped from the trap. David crossed himself and jumped onto the raft. Captain Weston cut the rope connecting them to the ghost ship. The raft pushed off from the hull and was carried away by the waves. They rowed with all their might, trying to get as far away from the Orang Medan as possible. The ship, silent and dark, remained behind. They looked back, and it seemed to grow larger, filling the entire horizon. And then, the fog began to thicken again. A morning fog, dense and white as milk, started to envelop the ship. Within minutes, the rusted Leviathan disappeared completely into the white shroud, as if it had never been there. It had vanished, returning to its phantom world, taking with it the secret of its crew and the mind of one of their companions. They spent nearly another full day in the ocean. 2 inflatable rafts, overcrowded with exhausted people, drifted in the open sea. The sun that emerged from behind the clouds brought no joy, only mercilessly burning their skin. They rationed their water and food, but it was not thirst or hunger that tormented them most. It was their memories. They barely spoke. Each was lost in their own thoughts, replaying the horrors of the previous night over and over. They stared at the horizon, and every cloud that resembled the silhouette of a ship made them flinch. Frank, the engineer, lay at the bottom of the raft, his gaze vacant. He He was no longer violent, but he did not respond to anyone. His mind had been left behind, on board the Orang Medan. Fortunately, they were spotted by a Coast Guard patrol plane. A few hours later, a rescue helicopter arrived, followed by a cutter. When they were brought aboard, the survivors felt no joy, only a deep, boundless exhaustion. The rescuers listened to their stories of a giant, rusty ship that appeared out of nowhere with skepticism, attributing it all to shock and post-traumatic stress. Radars had detected no unidentified vessels in that area. There were no records of a ship named Orang Medan in maritime registers for the past 50 years. The survivors returned to shore, but their former lives were shattered. Each of them was forever changed. Mark and Lisa, the young couple who had been so excited about the trip, separated a few months later. They could no longer look at each other without remembering the horror they had shared. Professor Humphrey tried to conduct his own investigation, digging through archives, searching for any mention of the Orang Medan. He found a few vague references to the mysterious disappearance of a Dutch vessel with that name in the 1940s, but no proof or details. The story was considered a maritime legend. Captain Weston never went to sea again. He sold everything he owned and settled far from the coast, in a small house in the mountains. But even there, he found no peace. At night, he was plagued by nightmares. He dreamed of rusty corridors, Frank's empty eyes, and the voices that called to him from the darkness. None of them ever dared to go out to sea again. For them, the ocean was no longer a symbol of freedom and adventure. It was now an abyss that concealed unimaginable horrors in its depths. An abyss from which the ghosts of the past sometimes rise to claim new souls. They had survived, but a part of them would forever remain there, aboard the ghost ship that still wanders the fogs of the Atlantic. To survive the elements is a feat in itself. To conquer a storm, to cheat the death that awaits in the cold waves. This is a testament to the incredible strength of the human spirit. But what do you do when death itself emerges from the fog and extends a helping hand, luring you into its trap? What do you do when salvation proves to be more terrifying than destruction? The story of the Orang Medan, which you have just heard, is but one of many that the ocean keeps. Some say it was mass hysteria, triggered by infrasound from faulty engines, poisoning from some toxic cargo fumes, or simply extreme psychological stress. Science always tries to find a rational explanation for the most incredible events. But those who were on board, those who heard the voices in the metal and saw the shadows in the empty corridors, they know the truth. They encountered something that lies beyond our understanding. Stories of ghost ships have existed for as long as humans have sailed the seas. The Flying Dutchman, the Mary Celeste, these are not just tales to frighten young sailors. They are echoes of real tragedies, reverberations of a horror forever imprinted in wood and steel. Some say the ocean keeps its secrets better than the land. It hides sunken cities, countless treasures, and millions of lost lives in its depths. And perhaps, sometimes, it releases its silent sentinels to the surface to remind us how fragile our civilization is in the face of eternity. Perhaps that is why the ghost ship, Orang Medan, still roams the world's waters, forever searching for new passengers for its final voyage to nowhere. And the next time you find yourself on the seashore and see a lone ship in the fog on the horizon, ask yourself, is there truly anyone alive on board?